This podcast is a member of the Place to Be Nation family. Visit us at placetobenation.com, the only place to be in your pop culture world.
Hey everybody, welcome to ChRAWnology, episode number 1 of the most impactful, the most important, and the only foolish podcast enough to go episode by episode of WWF/WWE Monday Night Raw from episode 1 up until, I guess when we get bored or our wives tell us we can't anymore. I'm Dave Thackara.
I'm Neil Trama, and yes, beyond that happening, we've pretty much created a podcast concept that will literally never end.
It's the Immortal Podcast.
We may actually die before we are able to completely finish this podcast.
Unless we want to try to do like 4 or 5 a week, like a daily Monday Night Raw recap, but frankly, unless COVID really affects our businesses, I don't see that as a possibility. So this is the Immortal Podcast that we will never, ever catch up on. As we said, WWF/WWE Monday Night Raw. It premiered way back in the day in 1993, and we're going to take it step by step, episode by episode, recap some winners, recap some losers, point out exactly who is currently dead and who's not, and have some fun along the way. Neil, why did we decide to do this?
Well, there's nothing more fun than pointing out who is and isn't dead. But we decided to do this because I think, as you put it, when we were trying to explain, and by explain I mean get permission from our wives to do this, that we are both red-blooded American males, and we work in the radio industry, and at some point we figured out that we didn't have a podcast, and there was no reason why we didn't have a podcast, so we're doing a podcast. Literally, the reason is because I texted you one day and said, hey Dave, let's do a podcast, and our choices were like Aaron Sorkin and this, so of course we picked the one with Doink the Clown.
You have to. There's really no choice. And if anyone pretends otherwise, they're fooling you. They're preparing yourself for disappointment. So why, Neil, let's be very clear about this. I am a passive, half-assed, I think is the right word for it, wrestling fan, where I enjoy it once I'm sort of watching it, but I'm really not like into the ins and outs. I don't read any of the wrestling, gossip sheets or anything like that. I don't know who the current champion is. I forget a lot of what I actually have watched through the years. So I'm just going to lean on you for a lot of the expertise for these.
And I think it'll work because in a lot of ways that makes us like the microcosm of people who consider themselves wrestling fans today, because you've got someone like me who, I'm not going to say that I live and breathe wrestling because I absolutely don't, but it is one of my favorite pastimes, one of my favorite hobbies. I've seen every episode of Raw, or at least, read a detailed recap and listened to a detailed podcast recap of every episode of Raw. I know what happened on every episode of Raw there's ever been. Let's say that. I became a fan right around the time Raw was starting. I've been watching ever since. So I know the ins and outs. I know the backstage stories. I know the backstage gossip. I've seen these shows a zillion times. And you, on the other hand, like you said, you're more of a casual fan. You kind of were a fan during the Stone Cold Steve Austin Attitude Era days. You've fallen in and out of it. You sort of follow along here and there. You're like, yeah, sure, Neil, I'll come over to your house for pizza in the Royal Rumble, whatever. I'll find out who's in it that afternoon. That's you as a fan. And it's a lot of America as a fan. So I hope we kind of can cover everyone here, from the hardcore fans like me that are going to get a kick out of looking back at these shows they've seen a million times, and somebody like you that's going to be seeing a lot of these for the very first time and through the eyes of a more casual observer.
Yeah, I'm a wrestling fan like I'm an outdoorsman, in the sense that I like to have a beer on a patio. Like, exactly. I'm a wrestling fan in the sense that I like to have a beer on your couch and have you explain to me exactly who's fighting who and why. All right, so wrestling on TV has been around since the invention of TV. Like, from the black and white days where they had the news to put on and maybe a Father Knows Best type sitcom and maybe Gunsmoke and Bonanza. And the rest of it was just professional wrestling. And professional wrestling has always been on TV. But how did it get to the point where we're watching Monday Night Raw coming at you live? How did Vince McMahon decide, I want Monday nights. I want my program on. And how did he find a TV partner? Do you know that?
Okay, so the absolute quickest Cliff's Notes version here I'll give you in the whole history of pro wrestling is this. Yeah, for the longest time, wrestling was territories. There was one kind of wrestling in New York, one kind of wrestling in Florida, one kind of wrestling in California, so on and so forth. Once the 80s hit, Vince McMahon bought the New York territory from his father, decided this is ridiculous. There's not different football leagues everywhere in the country. There's not different basketball leagues everywhere in the country. I'm going to take this thing national. Slowly, he either bought out those territories or he moved into their territory and competed to the point where they had to go out of business.
Or just stole their talent.
Exactly. That was a way he competed. And in fact, all the biggest stars of the 80s were big stars elsewhere before Vince McMahon came in and got them. Hulk Hogan was a star in Minneapolis, for instance, when he was doing the Rocky movies. And, Vince just swooped in, gave him more money, and suddenly he's the most well-known wrestler in the world. So that's what they did up until the 90s. By that point, they're pretty much the only game in town. WCW did exist as an offshoot of the territories down in the southern part of the United States, Atlanta, the Carolinas, and they did compete on a national level as well, but Vince was mainly the only game in town. Their main television partners were local syndicated stations, which makes sense when you think about it. So they'd do one show, say WWF Superstars, but then they would edit the individual copies for each individual station. So if Hulk Hogan versus the Macho Man Randy Savage is coming to Chicago next weekend, they could edit in an interview with Hulk Hogan talking about his match coming up in Chicago. Maybe on the same weekend in Seattle, the Hart Foundation is going to face the British Bulldogs for the tag belts. So they'll throw on interviews for that match instead. They were localized promos. They edited them into the shows, and that's how they promoted it, because at the time, the main way wrestling companies made money was by touring the country and selling tickets to these arena shows that were going on all around the USA. One of his minor shows was with his partner at the USA Network, who they were with since the 80s, a show called Primetime Wrestling. It's most known in the late 80s. It was hosted by Gorilla Monsoon and Bobby the Brain Heenan. There was a lot of entertaining banter in studio, and sometimes they'd go and do little skits on the road between the two of them. The matches themselves were generally crap. They were leftover matches from Superstars tapings, from Challenge tapings. Literally, I'm not kidding you, like a marquee match would be something along the lines of Hercules versus Haku. It would go 3 minutes, and that would be the marquee match of the week. Everything else would be something like the Brooklyn Brawler versus the Red Rooster in a 20-minute time limit draw that they recorded a month earlier at the Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto and never bothered to put on television because it sucked. That's literally what primetime wrestling was. And then as Gorilla Monsoon wanted to kind of, get away from doing a weekly show, Vince McMahon took over. They did a thing with a studio audience. They did a thing with a panel that was kind of like a football pregame show thing where they're kind of always yelling at each other. None of that really caught on either. And at the same time, the company was embroiled in a major steroid scandal. Vince McMahon was indicted for conspiracy to distribute steroids, and they needed to rehab the image of the company and launch some new stuff to kind of build up new interest. And this is what they did. They took the complete opposite of a show that showed leftover matches from their tapings, and they did a live show every week, 1 hour, in New York City, which Vince McMahon has always considered to be like the pulse of what's going on in the entertainment world. It's got to happen in New York. It's got to happen on Broadway. So that's what they did. They rented a ballroom and a theater in Manhattan and did this show every week. At least that's how it starts. And that's what brings us to January 1993.
January 11th, 1993. 38 years ago, all of a sudden, Monday Night Raw appears on a television station. And like you said, it's very clearly in a ballroom. It's got a couple of curtain-draped fabric ads draped over the balcony. It's got a massive ad for something called Ico Pro, which I'm sure we'll talk about in another couple of minutes. It's got mullets galore because it's 1993, and the video packages reflect the same. And the very first inkling of WWE Monday Night Raw ever to appear on camera, of course, it had to be Koko Beware the Birdman versus Yokozuna. That's the draw that's going to keep bringing people back week in and week out, the thing that'll get them hooked. The very first wrestler appearing on screen, all right, it's Macho Man as he's in the announcer booth, but the first match is Koko Beware versus Yokozuna. I can't believe what I'm seeing. Whose decision was it to put these two on for the curtain jerk match?
Well, you've got to realize, though, Dave, you got to watch this with 1993 eyes. Like I mentioned, those old primetime shows that this was replacing, this literally would have been a marquee match on one of those shows. And the fact that you got 3 matches of similar caliber actually did make this a big deal, because at the time, stars just didn't face stars on television all that often. And yes, in the, looking at it from 1993 eyes, Coco Beware is what passes for a star facing Yokozuna, who, let's face it, spoiler, they've got some big things in store for Yokozuna in the year 1993. So maybe wouldn't have been my choice. If you were going to pick from the 3 matches on the show, I would have probably made the Shawn Michaels match be the opener, because it had a chance to be a little bit better of a match. But Yokozuna squashes Coco. That's the historic first match. I don't know what to tell you other than, I could see why they did it if you look at it from 1993 eyes.
Fair enough. All right. And to be fair, I was so excited about Coco Beware and his jacket and his neon and checkerboard outfit that I skipped over 2 things that are hugely important to my viewing of this episode. The first of which was Macho Man Randy Savage and Vince McMahon in the announcer booth, which, say what you will about both of them personally, professionally, they are 2 of the absolute biggest names in the entire industry. And it's hard to understand and to understate the importance of Vince McMahon, especially as an owner, as a billionaire legend, as an announcer. He was still pretty good too.
Yeah, Vince McMahon was great at getting over the product. He couldn't really call moves, if that's what you're looking for in a play-by-play announcer, but he was absolutely great at getting over the personalities, which I like. Hey, I grew up with Vince. When I became a fan, Vince was the number 1 color commentator. Like, he is, in my mind, who I think of first when I think of wrestling commentators, are him and Gorilla Monsoon. Mm-hmm. Both of them were not the greatest, didn't get the greatest critical acclaim at the time, but they're a wrestling announcer to me. So I have no problem with Vince on commentary. I think he's great.
And I also loved Macho. I thought he brought a lot to the show. And for however much those 2 brought to the show, something named Rob Bartlett took it away. Who is Rob Bartlett? Why is he on this screen? And why do I, every minute, every millisecond that he's been in my life so far in this episode has made me hate starting this project, because I get the feeling he's going to be on more and more.
Yeah, Rob Bartlett. I was wondering when you were going to get to Rob Bartlett. He is absolutely atrocious. Thing with him, it's not really his fault. He got his fame doing characters on the Don Imus show on the radio program in New York. He's a stand-up comic. He used to do stand-up with Eddie Murphy, and he's actually still active in the entertainment business today. He's done a lot of guest spots on shows like Law and Order and The Good Wife. So he's made himself a very good career, but he didn't know anything about wrestling. They hired him because they wanted an outsider. They thought it would be edgy. They thought it would go along with the New York Broadway vibe to have a stand-up comic in there. He was basically Dennis Miller on Monday Night Football before they put Dennis Miller on Monday Night Football. It just didn't gel. Yes, he is going to be around for a little while. Yes, he is incredibly annoying every time he speaks. He's gone by the summer, though, so don't quit the podcast yet.
Fair enough, but there was a Mike Tyson bit in the middle of the episode
that's hideous.
Every time he tried to make a joke, it fell flat. I know it was dated, but even in the moment, it was totally cringeworthy. And you got to think that Vince is sitting next to him as the owner of the company going, good God, what have I done?
I don't know. I heard Vince laughing during some of those bits. He made a David Dinkins joke, if you want to talk about really dated humor.
And a Joey Buttafuoco joke with Amy Fisher, too. I had to Google them to figure out exactly what that story was. I kind of remembered it, but I didn't.
Then there's there's a Woody Allen reference later on in the show. There was a lot of weirdness in trying to be topical and trying to be edgy and funny that absolutely none of it hits. And it really, honestly, besides being annoying with the Tyson stuff, the big problem with Bartlett, and this was the takeaway from from a lot of people when this show first aired, was he did nothing to get over the wrestlers,
Right.
which is probably something he should have been smartened up on going in. Like, literally the first match, they're pushing Yokozuna to be one of the featured guys in the Royal Rumble, and literally one of the
He's
first...
making fat jokes.
Yes, one of the first bits between Rob Bartlett and Vince McMahon, and I had to write this down, okay? This is basically their first exchange during the match. Bartlett says, "That's one big-butted Oriental, Vince." And Vince replies, "In a manner of speaking." Okay, good one. You got me there.
I'm, again, riveted by the car crash that's in front of me, and simultaneously hating the fact that I'm rubbernecking exactly what this broadcast is all about. All right, so
And, you know, maybe this was for us because we did debate doing an Aaron Sorkin podcast, so we could have been talking about President Jed Bartlett right now, but instead we're talking about color commentator Rob Bartlett. Good idea, Dave.
Yeah, short end of the stick on that one. Good job by us.
Thanks, Dave. Anyway, no shock. Yoko squashes Coco en route to the Royal Rumble.
Then we move on to a Bobby Heenan promo. We saw him outside in a very kitschy running gag that's going to take us through most of the episode, and a C-line plot that's going to move all the way through. But now he's inside, and Bobby Heenan is talking about Narcissus and comparing Narcissus to Mr. Perfect. And one thing that I did like about the fact that, yeah, this is the very first episode of Raw, they sort of picked it up mid-season. You know what I mean? It's not like they're doing a whole lot of, hey, this is the very first Raw, we're brand new on the scene, blah, blah, blah. They mentioned it a couple of times with we're raw, we're uncut, we're unedited, blah, blah. But they didn't make it feel like a new show. They made it feel like you're already 100 episodes in, because they're just going to pick up where they want to pick up. And if you're left behind, I'm sure you'll catch up somewhere along the way.
Well, yeah, what you got to realize, Dave, what was happening here. I mean, this just took over for Primetime Wrestling. It was in the same time slot. So really just Primetime Wrestling that had been on since the mid-'80s just became Monday Night Raw. It just suddenly became a different show with a different look. So, you know,
okay.
that's how this works.
All right. So after this, after the very tough promo where Mr. Perfect is compared to horse manure, the Steiner brothers come out in their fabulous 90s costumes, and they meet a group of someone's called the Executioners, which, because they're wearing masks, I'm assuming that we've already seen them at some point during the broadcast in their actual face.
It's not quite that bad, but yeah, that is the origin of the Executioners gimmick as jobbers. It's jobbers Barry Hardy and Dwayne Gill. And yes, that is the Dwayne Gill who would go on to be Gilbert in the late 90s. They were both jobbers, and their way of getting extra work at TV tapings is they bought matching masked costumes so they could wrestle on the same show as themselves, and then later as the Executioners. That literally is the story behind this. And thankfully they both went on to live at least reasonably fulfilled lives, because there is a spot where Rick Steiner almost murders one of them. I don't know which one it is. He tries to Irish whip him into the ropes, and instead the Executioner falls down and snaps his neck back on the middle rope, which has literally killed human beings in real life in mistakes in the ring, famously. So yeah, look, I mean, I knew the Executioner didn't die in the ring on the very first Raw. I think that would have been the headline from that show had it happened, but I did still scream when I saw it back again.
The match came and went. I think we know who, was going to be the winner as soon as they were introduced. When one series of guys got the full walk up, and then the other guys were already in the ring sort of jumping around and warming up. Now we move on to yet another fabulous promo with Bobby Heenan, which we've said enough about. And now we're going to go to the number one contender for the Intercontinental Championship, Razor Ramon.
Yeah, Razor's going for the WWF Championship against Bret Hart at the Royal Rumble, and this is kind of like the end of his major push as a top guy. I mean, he came in, they immediately paired him with Ric Flair. He was feuding with Macho Man Randy Savage, so he gets the title match here at the Royal Rumble. Pretty standard stuff. I mean, he's got the Razor gimmick down. He made a whole career out of talking like that and doing his little Scarface impression, and I mean, he's good here. There's not much more to say about it. I'm not going to say it got me all that excited for the Royal Rumble match, but, it is what it was.
I'll just add this. For a guy whose gimmick is having a toothpick all the time, He had a gnarly bit of something between his teeth when they got really up close and personal on him in the camera. Go back and watch. You'll see that it's there.
Let me make a note of that. Go back, look at Scott Hall's teeth. Okay.
Now we're talking about headlock on hunger. Is this like one of these annual things, or was this a one and done?
This is a one and done. This is kind of this was their, they started doing a lot of these things to get good publicity because of all the steroid stuff that was going on at the time and all the bad publicity they were getting. One of them was they teamed up with the Special Olympics and did a lot of promotion with them. And that went on for a long time. This was something separate they did. This was at the time, a big news story, the famines going on in Africa and in Somalia. And, you have the whole, incident that inspired Black Hawk Down around that time with the U.S. troops going into Somalia. So this was all around that same time in the news. And yeah, they did a couple, I think, charity shows at Madison Square Garden to raise money for the headlock on Hunter. And I think Macho Man runs down the card for one of those shows here. Yeah, that's what that was. I mean, it was a good deed on the part of the company. I mean, it was done as a good deed because they were getting terrible publicity everywhere else. But I mean, let's face it, that's why companies in America do good deeds most of the time anyway. So, whatever. I guess you can't totally fault them for that. They did give money to charity. It was not imaginary, at least.
Fair enough. After this, we get our first glimpse of someone who you could actually rely on regularly in the WWE for years and decades to come as a main guy. Shawn Michaels, the Heartbreak Kid, taking on something called Max Moon.
Okay. Yeah, so we have Shawn Michaels, Intercontinental Champion. This is an Intercontinental title match. I've got to tell you a little bit about Max Moon because unfortunately he's not going to be around much longer.
No.
Max Moon. He has one of my greatest favorite stories about how a person got a wrestling gimmick in history. Okay. Do you know how Paul Diamond became Max Moon?
No clue.
Okay, Paul Diamond, longtime AWA wrestler, former tag team partner, and feuded with Shawn Michaels and the Rockers in the AWA. I think that's why they matched them up here, because they figured they'd have a good match together. He was in the WWF for a while as the masked Kato of the Orient Express. And around late 1992, Vince had this idea for a superhero from outer space gimmick called Maximilian Moon. They had this fancy, elaborate costume made that shoots fireworks and confetti. There was a period of time when he wore a jetpack that shot smoke to allegedly propel him to fly into the ring. And it was all done for high-flying Mexican luchador Conan, who was coming in to play the gimmick. And yes, this is Conan of WCW fame later on in the 90s.
Wait. If that's the same guy, did you just use the word high flying?
Yeah, Conan had some injuries that, kind of stopped the high flying. But yes, he was a luchador. He was one of the most, well-regarded Mexican wrestlers at the time, was involved in the formation of the AAA organization. That's a major player in Mexican wrestling right now. And that would be a whole other podcast if we talked about that. Point is, they were going to bring him in. He was going to get a huge push as a big star, but he had a falling out with Vince before he ever even debuted, ended up not coming into the company, quit, but they had already created this expensive, elaborate costume. So they went backstage and found a guy who happened to fit into the suit, and it was Diamond. So he became Max Moon by virtue of being the guy backstage who fit into the costume they already had made.
That is simultaneously awesome and horrific for him.
Yeah, it didn't last long. And in fact, I went back and read the Observers at the time. He was already fired by the time the first Raw show happened. This is also a great story. He was already fired, but they forgot to tell him. So he showed up at the Manhattan Center and they sent him out there because they figured he'd have a good match with Shawn. And he finished up and they had him booked for a couple more dates after this, I guess, to throw him a bone. But then he was officially fired for real by February.
Well, again, after hearing that, and because it's a title match on the first episode of Raw, we know that the belt didn't change hands, and we know exactly who won. It was fun. I will say it was not a horrible match.
Yeah, it probably would have been a better opener than the Yokozuna Koko Beware squash match. They had a decent match. It was fine. It was nothing special, but yeah, I'm pretty sure the one and only time we're going to see Mr. Moon on these Monday Night Raw shows.
First and only if you're keeping track at home.
Was it during this match? Because I made a note about this that I had to talk about this because I had to look this up. I don't know if it was during this match or the Steiner Brothers match. Did you notice when Vince McMahon was promoting that a guy named Mitch Farrat from the Buffalo Bills was going to be debuting in the WWF soon?
I didn't pick up on that at all.
Okay, he said it, and I had to look this up because I've never heard of Mitch Farrat. And yes, he is indeed Gus Farrat's cousin, more famous NFL player. Won a national championship with Penn State. Went on to play in a bunch of those Super Bowls in the 90s with the Bills. Holds the NFL record for most touchdowns in a season by an offensive lineman. The season that just happened there, the 92 season, he had scored 3 touchdowns as an offensive lineman. Huge wrestling fan, used to use his, the little eye paint that the athletes put under their eyes for the glare. He used to paint his up to look like a road warrior, and he really, really wanted to be a wrestler, but I guess injuries curtailed that. So I never knew that before until I looked it up this morning, but I guess he was planning on being a wrestler. And I don't know if you want to include him in your count, but he also prematurely passed away due to an enlarged heart. So he would have fit right in the mid-90s wrestling scene, but unfortunately, Mr. Farrat never made it that far.
Definitely counts. 100% definitely counts. I am a big fan of Mean Gene Okerlund, and hearing his voice, it soothes me. It takes me back to my simpler days of childhood. I love it. I think he is the consummate wrestling broadcaster for what JR and for what Vince McMahon were calling the action. I think, to me, Mean Gene Okerlund is the absolute goat of all goats for, I'm just going to tell you what's happening in a couple of weeks in Rochester, Minnesota at the War Memorial Stadium. I love it. I love it so much. I love his shtick. I love everything about him. I would wear his shoes proudly if given the chance. He's just a great dude.
And for as much as the Razor interview didn't get me excited for the Royal Rumble, I feel like Gene's report did, even though I've seen that Royal Rumble like 50 times and I know it's terrible. I mean, he really made this sound exciting. Listen to these names, Dave. Yes, I wrote them all down. These gentlemen have all declared for the Royal Rumble match in a couple weeks. Ric Flair, all right, former champ. We can get behind Flair, last year's winner. Tatanka, the undefeated Native American superstar. We've got both tag champs, IRS and Ted DiBiase. Bob Backlund, former world champion. Jerry the King Lawler, who had just debuted. He's an announcer on Superstars. Mr. Perfect, who's getting a big push. Crush, the model, Rick Martel. Yokozuna, the Macho Man, who is, of course, the Macho Man. And then this is where things kind of fall off the rails. Papa Shango, Earthquake, the Berserker, the Undertaker. All right, we can get behind him. Then they start bringing in random foreigners like Carlos Colon and Tenaru. Tito Santana back out of Mothballs. Typhoon, both head shrinkers. They can't even be bothered to introduce individually. And then also back out of Mothballs, Hacksaw Jim Duggan. I'm so pumped we may have to watch this Royal Rumble, Dave.
I'll let you do it and report to me back with the results.
Okay, deal. And we should talk about the Bobby Heenan bit, I guess, here too. The gimmick is Sean Mooney is out on the street, reporting from the street for God knows what reason. And Bobby Heenan doesn't have a pass to get into the building because he thinks he's going to be the announcer, but they hire Rob Bartlett instead. So he puts on a bunch of random disguises, dresses as a woman, dresses as a rabbi, all in an attempt to get in. It's not Bobby Heenan's best comedy, but compared to the Rob Bartlett commentary going on at the same time, it's absolutely hilarious.
It's impossible to choose a winner as to who did a worse job in trying to make me laugh during this episode, but I think that Bobby Heenan dressed as a Hasidic Jew, trying to break in, making all sorts of, if you can imagine it, kind of like xenophobic comments on his way in. This might have been the absolute lowest point of the entire episode for me.
Really? See, I don't think it's worse than the Mike Tyson impression from Rob Bartlett. There's also a point in the Shawn Michaels match where he says that he thinks Shawn pulled a knife on Max Moon. That didn't age too well either.
Well, after Bobby Heenan, yet again, does not get inside. Oh, the hilarity. Will this come back again? Will we get a resolution to this story? God, I hope so. We've got what we would call the main event of the match. We've got The Undertaker taking on something called Damien Demento.
From the outer reaches of your mind, Dave. That was where he was billed from. You know, not Chicago, not Phoenix, not Albuquerque, but the outer reaches of your mind is Mr. Demento. It shouldn't come as any shock that he doesn't last very long in the WWF, nor does he last long in the ring with The Undertaker, who squashes him in a couple of minutes. I really have nothing to say about this match. As a main
Other
event,
than the fact that we have seen in the crowd, if you watch behind it, we've got a couple of Doink appearances in the Shawn Michaels match, and I believe this match as well.
we do.
I've never been a wrestling booker, and I know I'm looking at this through the eyes of 2021 America, and it just seems strange to me that you're going to have that much of a build-up for Doink the Clown just to try to insert him into the show in one way, shape, and form.
Yeah, Doink was all over these late 92, early 93 shows, and he does get a pretty big push. So, I mean, I guess they do the interview with Crush later on to end the show, but we're going to talk a lot more about Doink as these Monday Night Raw shows go on, because he's going to be all over these shows. So we'll have a lot of time to talk about the good and the bad of the Doink gimmick. And then, I mean, that's pretty much it for the first Raw.
So, Neil, episode 1 of WWE's Monday Night Raw for ChRAWnology in the books. What are your lasting impressions of this? Someone says to you, first episode Raw. What's like the one or two things that you're gonna remember about it? And then who's your champ this week? Who's your GOAT this week?
Well, I mean, obviously, they've got the formula right down, because this is what all these Raw shows are like for a long time going forward. There's some squash matches, there's some feature matches, there's some random comedy, there's some interviews, there's the Manhattan Center. I mean, this is Raw for at least the first 6 months of its existence. It exists in this form. So they got the format right down. I think overall, it's a great show. It's obviously a historic show. I mean, none of the wrestling is knocked out of the park, but compared to those old prime times, this show is light years better. I promise you that. Like, if you're bored one afternoon, load up a primetime on the network from 1989, and you're going to see why this show was such a revolution at the time. So I think overall, as a wrestling show that was, at the end of the day, it was just meant to promote the wrestlers, get them over as stars, and get you to buy the Royal Rumble. I think they did everything they needed to do to get that done. And to pick an MVP, which I know we're going to try to make this a recurring feature where every week we kind of vote on and pick our MVP, our star of the show, so to speak. From a wrestling standpoint, I'm going to go with Shawn Michaels, but his match was really nothing special, and I promise you he's going to win this award plenty of times over the years. So I'm actually tempted to go with a non-wrestler. I mean, if you look back at our podcast here, the one guy that we both kind of raved about is Gene Okerlund. So, I mean, is Gene Okerlund our MVP? Which way were you leaning?
He will be my MVP each and every week if it comes to that. But for this week and this week alone, you know what? I'm going to do something that I didn't anticipate me doing when we started taping this show. I think I'm going to give my MVP this week to the Birdman, Koko Beware. You're out first. You're in your full 90s getup. Your match wasn't bad. You put Yokozuna over. My MVP of the week, Birdman, Koko Beware.
Okay, so you know what? I'll give it to Sean instead of Mean Gene. Mean Gene, I guess he wasn't even actually on the show. It was just a pre-tape, Royal Rumble report. So I'll go Sean, you go Coco. We're going to keep a running tally of this and see who ends up with the most votes at the end of the year, and really forever. We're going to kind of just have a top 10 forever here on this show. Top 10 or top 5 or whatever we decide to do. So one show in the books. We've got the Birdman, Koko Beware, who I don't think is going to appear too many more times. So I don't think he's going to hold on to that top spot too long. And Shawn Michaels, who, spoiler alert, but Shawn Michaels will appear on Raw a few more times than Koko Beware over the years.
Yeah. All right, this has been it for episode 1 of ChRAWnology. I'm Dave.
I'm Neil, and I promise we'll both get better at this.
Don't make any promises like that. Come on.